Hi, everyone, and welcome to our last and final Ask Flutter segment. We're going to be talking all about Dart, the language, and Null Safety. A lot of cool features to talk about, a lot of cool things going on here. With me here again is John Ryan, and we also have another guest, Michael Thomsen. Thank you both for joining us.
Hi.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, wherever, depending on where you are. Michael, in particular, you're new to the Flutter Day stream, so I'm curious for your thoughts first. What is it about Null Safety that you find particularly interesting or compelling?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I am a product manager on the Dart team. Null Safety is a feature that really excites me. It's something I've worked with the awesome Dart language team on for several years now. And there's many layers to that feature, and excited about all of them. It begins with another great tool for declaring your intent in APIs. You can very clearly differentiate between things you want to be null and you don't want to be null. And when you consume an API, whether you look at the code or you're in Dart doc, it becomes really easy to see what the intent is. Second, I think it's a great feature for developer productivity. As you're writing your code, you will see analysis time errors that before where runtime crashes. So it really helps you catch those things really early. And then third, it's not just good for developers. It's really good for the app consumers as well. Dart has sound null safety. So we not only make the apps more safe and less prone to crashing, we will also get better performance with sound null safety.
Awesome. Yeah. John, did you have any additional thoughts on what about it is that, what about Null Safety is compelling to you?
Well, I think one unique thing too is that the Dart language allows or provides the tools to migrate your code. So there's a migration tool that will be coming out. And so having the ability to, as a developer, easily upgrade is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I look at some of these questions that came in from Ask Flutter before the streams, so over the last couple of weeks, we have a question from Sagar from India who is asking, what is the next big feature after Null Safety that the Dart team is working on? Michael, as a product manager for Dart, I was wondering if you could give us some insight there.
Yeah, I can try. So at any point in time, we actually work on a range of features because we go through a very long, elaborate process when we add new language features. We start with, looking at a great pool of ideas, some coming from the community, some coming from the team itself, some coming from our customers. We do brainstorming, we write initial proposals. We write very detailed proposals, we write specifications, we do prototypes, and then eventually at some point we do implementation. And along that whole path, some ideas we had initially that we thought were great turn out to be not so great. So it's sort of a funnel process. And one of my favorite things about working on the Dart project is that we are an open source project. So we're very open with information. So if you go to the Dart Lang organization on GitHub and you look in the language repo, under projects, you will find what we call the language funnel. And that's how we track all the features, all the way from, initial ideas, all the way to implementation. So that's a great way of getting some insight into what we're working on. And you will see a few things there, like we're looking at type aliases, we're considering the whole space around multiple return values, and a few other things.
John, anything that piqued your interest in terms of going through some of those new features coming up, and any one particular that you're interested in seeing?
Well, I think the multiple return value sounds interesting. I'm planning to read more about that. That's one of the things that I like too, is that you can go to the language issue tracker and participate, read through the discussions. Everything is very open.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great way, just as someone not on the Dart team, to keep up with where things are and where things are going, and any of the new things that are coming on. So definitely appreciate that openness for sure. So I'm going to go to some of our live stream questions. We've got a number from Ask Flutter from Twitter, but we've got some here from the live stream. And so this, looking at Dart features in particular, Alexander is asking about why, when we extend abstract classes that have constructor parameter child class. Wait, let me reread this. Alexander says, why, when we extend abstract class that has constructor parameter child class, does not extend it? Trying to figure out what Alexander's trying to say here. So what I'm reading that as is, let's say I have an abstract class and it has a parameter in the constructor, and I have a new class that extends that abstract class. It sounds like Alexander is saying that extension doesn't inherit that constructor parameter. That's my interpretation of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I'd have to look at the code actually to fully answer this, but I don't believe abstract classes can have constructors. I could be wrong on that. So I'm a little bit confused by that question.
Yeah, that probably, yeah. That probably makes sense for why the child doesn't inherit the constructor then. If abstract classes can't have the constructor, then that would be why the implementation doesn't accept it or inherit it. So when we get into the Dart compiler itself, we had a number of questions on Ask Flutter ahead of time about the compiler and performance and app size and a number of other things. And the question in particular is, does the AOT compiler perform a tree shake to remove other platforms' code? And if not, is it going to be in the future? Michael, you're nodding yes. John, you're nodding yes. Michael, starting with you, like tree shaking, talk us through that.
Yeah. Do you want to take this one, John?
Yeah, it's something that was added originally for the web. So Dart is a web language. It compiles to the web, and reducing the JavaScript code size is super important. But if you do it at the kernel level, at the language level, you get those same benefits when you compile for AOT. So any iOS or Android app that uses Flutter removes any unused code. And if you're a Flutter developer, we do have some documentation on measuring your app size. There is a doc on that on the flutter.dev website.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is also when you use platform-specific plugins, the Flutter build system makes sure only to pull in what's needed for the platform you're building for. So generally, I believe we have pretty good support for making sure that you can target all the various platforms.
Awesome. And so I have another one from, I think this one is a little bit easier than the last one, from the live stream. Arakash asks, will the new keyword be removed anytime in the future? Or will I have to refactor my existing apps to not use new anymore in case future versions of Dart drop new support? So new support, where is it going? I know it's kind of come and gone, and whether it's optional or required and what's the best practice. Are we just going to remove it at some point, or is it going to stay around? Michael?
That's a good question. Let me talk about the background a little bit. So that was actually a language feature we built in collaboration with the Flutter team, I think about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. Because when we started looking at UI code for Flutter apps, which is sort of a very special thing, right? There's no second language for describing the UI. It's all just Dart code. There were a lot of news as you're trying to read down your widget tree, and they seemed a little redundant, and they sort of got in the way of seeing all the types you're instantiating. But of course, it'd be a very breaking change to suddenly change the constructor syntax for Dart. So we designed this feature for optional news in constructor calls. And I think we were a little uncertain about how it'd be received, but I think it's been a runaway success. And I use it all the time myself, and whenever I see code snippets from customers, it's also the predominant style. I believe also a number of people actually by now have configured lints to make sure that their code bases don't use new. So sort of a reminder you can configure as you're coding. Would we ever outright de-support it? I mean, I've learned in this industry never to say never. We don't have any such current plans, but who knows?
John, does your code have news in it or not?
No, I think I add that lint actually.
Makes sense. Yeah, I've just always not used new. I personally learned Dart in the context of Flutter, and I just stopped. I just never used new, and so that I just never got into the habit. But that lint sounds super useful too. And I know a lot of people coming from other languages get used to saying this thing is a class-like thing, therefore I need to use a new. And so it's then nice to have a reminder that it's not necessary, and can kind of feel the redundancy when you get into that tree with all the news. Yeah, so going over to Ask Flutter from Twitter, we have a low-level question here about Dart, and where Firat is asking why Dart doesn't have a real multi-threading implementation. They watched official videos that they're trying to answer this question, but they couldn't find a decent. It sounds like they couldn't get a real sense for the reason there. Why can't Dart code run on multiple cores, and what is the motivation behind not having a real multitasking implementation?
The multi-threading is probably one of the most complicated topics in computer science. I recall back to being a student. It was just simply one of the things you fought with the most. Very abstractly, it gets really tricky when you have multiple threads in shared state, because then you need synchronization. And when we designed Dart a long time ago, that was not the complexity we thought we wanted to bring to the table. What we do have in Dart, though, is still support. You can utilize multiple cores. We have a much simpler model based on something we call isolates. And isolates do not share state, and thus you do not get into the synchronization problems. It's still a space, though, that we look at from time to time, and there's actually some really exciting prototyping happening right now, where we're looking at, can we kind of get the best of both worlds? Because something we're seeing in Flutter apps is this desire to do work in the background while the UI is still running really smoothly. And then when some background process is done doing something, can you kind of hand the result back to the UI? And this can be a bit tricky with the current isolate model. So I'm really hopeful we can do something in that area where we kind of combine the two things and get the best of both worlds. What do you think, John? Do you use isolates?
Yeah, we have a Flutter sample for isolates. One common use case is deserializing a large JSON blob, and you really don't want to be doing something that large on the UI thread. So using an isolate is a great use case there. Exciting to see the new experiments we're running and what we could do in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely reminisce back to studying multi-threading in operating systems and being, that's complicated stuff for sure. So I've got a pair of questions here that feel related to me, so I want to ask them simultaneously. So we have one from Ask Flutter beforehand on Twitter, from Jaff, and we have a question in the live stream from Herman, and both of these questions relate to kind of the separation and the intertwining of Dart and Flutter. So Jaff from Ask Flutter asked, will we ever be able to incorporate backend development using Dart? And Herman on the live stream asks, is Dart and Flutter meant to be a markup language with little logic and to write just the view layer and then interface with some backend like Kotlin, C++, Rust, or something else, and what interface is recommended there? So those to me kind of are both saying, is Dart Flutter only, or are there other things you can do with it as well?
I love that
John,
question. Maybe I can.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
Sorry for jumping in here. I'm passionate about this one.
Yes.
Let me talk a little bit about the last part, and then maybe John can talk about the first part. So Dart is a fully fledged programming language, right? And we very much have a layered model where the Dart SDK sits below the Flutter SDK. And there are lots of awesome experiences that we power in the Flutter SDK through the Dart SDK. But I think if you sort of poke around a bit and look at what we do ourselves, and also when I talk to customers, there are many other things you can do with Dart. And one of them actually happens to be backends. So John, can you maybe talk a little bit about what you see with backends?
Yeah, so I work a little bit on Dartpad, and the Dart Services project is fully open source, and it's purely running in Dart. And the other project that we run on the back end is Pub itself. So you can check out the source code for those and see how that's working. One of the main packages is Shelf that I'm familiar with. There's also some really great community packages like Aqueduct and I think there's one more.
Angel is another one I've seen.
Angel, yes. I haven't used Angel myself, but.
Yeah, I tried it out once not too long ago. It was pretty nice. It was pretty decent. And so I'm hearing basically yes. Like if you want to use Dart for something other than Flutter, yeah, absolutely, go and do it. It supports it just as well as we'd want it to. And I think there was a second question kind of wrapped up in the last one from Herman, who was asking about what if I did want to have an interface to something else? So I could see maybe I want to use Dart as the controller for an embedded thing on Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, and I need to call out to some C code potentially to interface with something else. How do I do that in Dart? What's the interface there?
Oh, there are a number of things you can do there. When it comes to traditional backends, I talk to a bunch of customers that just basically do it with networking, whether it's straight HTTP or you use something like gRPC that's more structured. And there's a lot of flexibility there. So I even hear some customers that maybe start with a backend in not Dart and move it to Dart, or the other way around. They prototype in Dart and then they build a production stack in Go or something. And if you use something like gRPC, you can swap those things out pretty easily. What else did I forget, John? I guess there are other ways we can interop as well, right?
We also have FFI, right?
Yes.
So
for those who don't know FFI, can you define that for us?
It's a foreign function interface API for Dart. So if you have C code, you can grab references to pointers to C objects in memory, structs in memory. And we do have some samples for that in the Dartlang samples repo. And we are maintaining that and making sure that anyone who's trying to use that is having a good experience.
Yeah, FFI can be really great, whether you're calling the operating system and some of those APIs that often are native APIs, or maybe you have some existing native codes that you just want to hold on to a little bit longer. And FFI is a great way of leveraging that.
So there's a number of questions about specific Dart features. And do we support certain things, or will we support certain things? I want to get a couple of them and then maybe get your thoughts on, and I know, Michael, you kind of addressed this at the top of our time, but the thoughts on the development of new features and how people can keep tabs on a feature that they want, or maybe suggest a new one, or maybe see if they can affect that decision in some way. So there's a couple that we can look at. The first one from, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, but Erluxman is asking, when will we get a data class-like feature? For example, rich enum types or sealed classes in Dart. Those would be great. I mean, I've tried to build an enum based on my fingers type from other languages. I just want to do enum curly bracket and then do something, and it doesn't exist. So are we going to get some kind of sealed data class like that at some point in the future?
That's a really, really exciting space. And there's a range of features there. You could do data classes alone. You could do sealing alone. You could do the two things together. You could combine it with enums. There's just a lot of combinatorics there that makes it really interesting. And actually, that's also one of the things that makes it really hard, because we've looked at this a number of times. And when we talk to various customers, you get different feelings for what it is they're looking for. That being said, I mean, I personally, at least, I'm very interested in looking at, is there something we can do to really make it less laborious to create classes that predominantly carry state? So I can't really promise any specific feature right now, but it's definitely an area I hope we can look at in the coming period.
Yeah, so John, I'm curious, without having a dedicated data class or enum or similar, how do you manage classes that are just containers for data?
Typically, what I do would be to just use a Dart class, plain old Dart object, make all the fields final, and give it a constructor that initializes all the fields. And generally that works. And there's also some third-party solutions for immutable data types and things like that that do automatic serialization, deserialization for you if you really want something that has a lot of features. So there's plenty of solutions available, but yeah, I think this is definitely a hard, tricky design problem to figure out what's most useful and usable.
And I think that you asked something.
Go ahead.
I think you asked something else about, like, how can someone who's a Dataflow developer help provide us more information? Generally, we really, really encourage engagement in our issue trackers. If there is some request you have, please go check out the issue tracker. Please do a search first and see if someone else wrote up a ticket for it already. And if you find any such existing issues tracking things you'd like to see, we really recommend that you find like the topmost comment on GitHub and you press the thumbs up button. And from time to time, we go that as one of the signals we look at to see what to consider in a future release.
Yep, makes sense. Make heavy use of that thumbs up button when things don't thumbs up everything maybe, but the ones you really want to see. Unless you really want to see everything, in which case, I don't know, maybe that's what we should do. So I'm gonna jump ahead in the live stream questions momentarily, because I think we answered this. So I just want to confirm, and John, you were talking about this when we were talking about multi-threading and isolates, and you were suggesting that if you're serializing, deserializing JSON, that it's nice to have it done in an isolate somewhere other than the UI thread, right?
Yeah, for large blobs, yeah.
Right. So we have a question from Dartland in the live stream who's asking, can't count the zeros right now, but 10 or 100,000 lines of JSON, if it can be serialized on a single thread, or should it be serialized on a single thread, or do I need to make a separate isolate for a very large JSON file? Sounds like we've got the answer to that.
I think if Philip were here, he would say measure first before you optimize. So that's going to be my recommendation there. So make sure you can run a benchmark and see the problem, understand it, and see if you can improve it from there. Yeah. Yeah,
I think that reminds me of our answers in the last Ask Flutter question or segment of it depends. So try it out, see what happens. It depends on your own specific JSON.
But by default, I don't use isolates for JSON because I generally don't have large JSON blobs. But
there are also a lot of the Dart APIs that are asynchronous, and generally they should not be blocking. So as long as you make sure you structure your UI so that you don't block on results from them, you should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of blocking on results, we've got a question from Yaya who is asking about so let's say I've got a function and it's relatively expensive to run, and I might need to run that multiple times, whether it's making a network call, going out to disk, making some complex calculations, whatever happens to be, it's really expensive. Is there a way to cache the result rather than having to do it again? Michael?
Yeah, go ahead.
Or John?
Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so the way I do caching is I just do it by hand. So in my Dart class, I generally just keep a private field for the most recent result that I've gotten. And if your app is such that you can cache data in that way, then that's probably the best way to do it. If you need to persist that data, that's a separate topic. If you need to save it to disk, obviously there's more involved there. But if you can cache it in memory, that's great.
And if I just add to that, caching is tricky, right? It's not just putting it in the cache. It's also refreshing the cache. It's cleaning out the cache. It's a lot of things, actually. So I would recommend, if you have a more advanced coding problem like this, sometimes go and check out the pub.dev repository and see if someone else thought of and solved this already. I know there are a bunch of packages there that handle things like caching images from the network and similar things. There's no reason to rewrite and reinvent these things. If there's a high quality solution, you can just take off the shelf.
Yeah, for example, the async package has async cache that can be used for this class of problems, which is kind of nice. So getting into maybe our fundamental, our primitive types a little bit. There's a couple of questions sort of in this vein. And sort of primitive types. So Khalid is asking, why is string capitalized when int, num, etc. are not? John?
That's a really good question. I wonder if you have an answer, John, because I remember I have asked the language team this a couple of times, but I've forgotten the answer.
Yeah, it's a mystery. No one knows.
Yeah, I have the answer for other languages, but not for Dart.
I don't actually remember. This is embarrassing.
Sounds like we'll have to follow up on that one and maybe put out a little bit of information on that one. It's a good question. But also looking at some of our other type-like things, we have Polygeek in Asheville, North Carolina, is asking if there's a way to do function comparisons. So can I say, does function 1 equal function 2? And the only documentation they found was a request made in 2011, apparently, that was rejected. So this is a question from a couple weeks ago from Ask Flutter. So Michael, function comparison.
If I can just say that first, I love the fact that we actually have issues from 2011. It just goes to show how long we've actually been working on this thing, and I think how much value we've built up over the years here. I did actually look at this not too long ago because someone asked a similar question, and I think if you find this issue, I think it's being referred to is like bug 100 and something. So it's a very, very old bug. And back then we did not support function comparisons. We do now. So you can compare top level functions, static functions. There's a few cases around things that sort of are surrounded by states where you don't always can do comparisons because those functions are bound to their surrounding state. But in generally you can.
Excellent. So the last video we watched with Kevin and Bob was all about null safety. And so I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about null safety here as well. And so we have a question that says, I keep hearing that, and they kind of address this, but I want to dive into it. That even after null safety is adopted, so let's say I take my app and I make it null safe, but there's still a chance that there could be some runtime null exceptions. Why is that? What's going on there? John, how about you take this one?
Well, we saw a little bit of that with the late keyword when Bob and Kevin were explaining this, but there are cases where you would want that behavior. Michael, maybe you can add more.
Yeah, so I think there are two cases. There are the ones where you have an app that's entirely null safe, but we build in a couple of power features that allows you to sort of escape the system and say, I want to use that bang operator, and I want to assert that I know what the value of this is, and I know it's not null. Those are power features, and you should use them sparingly, and you should only do that in well-tested code where you know what's happening. As long as you just use the rest of the feature, you're entirely safe. Then the second category is if you have an app that has many dependencies, and let's say this is right after we launched the feature, and there's one or two of your dependencies that have not enabled null safety yet, then you end up with a combination of code that is null safe and code that isn't, which is fine. We actually build support for running that code, and in many cases it'll be fine. But sometimes when you hop over those boundaries between code that has been migrated and hasn't, some things end up being runtime checks, and you can get nulls there. So generally, we are going to recommend that everybody who owns packages, they get started migrating on those early on. And then later, when most of the packages have been migrated, we hope that app developers can come in and sort of get all their dependencies fully null safe and really stay in a sound world.
Cool. So that means I can upgrade my app and maybe hit some runtime exceptions if I haven't upgraded anything. And then once I fully upgrade, I can expect a lot fewer, maybe no runtime exceptions.
Yeah. And we're building out a lot of tooling for this. So the pub.dev side will tell you what things have migrated. When you compile your app, we'll try and give you some output so you can see whether we compile things soundly or not, and a few other things like that.
Cool. So sounds like we've got time for just a couple of questions. So trending a tiny bit into Flutterland. I know a lot of my widgets, especially stateful widgets, have a dispose method. So they have an init state and a dispose. And so along that line, like that sounds to me like constructor and destructor. And Jorge is asking, will there be a destructor in classes in the future? For example, a method that is called before we destroy an object. Will that is that in the plans? And if not, or if yes, like how does that play into Dart's current notion of object management? That last question is mine, not Jorge's. But yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah. We currently don't do it because it ends up really tying in with how the garbage collector works, right? Because if there is semantics around when you get destructed, which is when the garbage collector is about to go collect you, then that ends up with a lot of limitations on what you can do. And one of the lesser known facts about like to what big extents we go to create high performing apps is we actually customize even things like the garbage collector to work great for Flutter apps. So we basically profile Flutter apps. We know that they do a lot of object construction, so we tune that so we can do GC on those things really quickly. But that being said, I think there will be a few specialized cases where this is still a useful capacity. And very recently, for example, when we were discussing the FFI feature we talked about earlier, it turns out on that boundary between Dart code and native code, then having some notion of finalization on the native side and having that have an impact on the Dart side can actually be quite useful. So I think we might still see it in specialized cases like that. But we have no current plans to kind of do it at the general level.
That makes sense. It definitely makes sense. I am seeing in back channels that the string capitalization there's an open issue in the Dartlang repository on this topic exactly, and so if anyone watching wants to check that out, there is a discussion there. It is, as I'm looking at it, quite a long discussion actually about that topic exactly. So it sounds like multiple people are confused, including our own team. So it's okay to ask that question and have that question around. Okay, so I've got one last question on the topic of Flutter, and it's kind of a yes or no question. But if Dash flutters until her flutterable wings are flutteringly fluttered. How many flutteriness widgets are left flutterless?
It's not null, I think.
Yeah, okay.
That threw a runtime exception in my brain.
All right, you got to go to Null Safety, John, so we can get rid of those.
Exactly.
Yeah. You have some dependencies that haven't migrated yet.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you both so much for being with us. That brings us to the end of our last Ask Flutter segment of the day. Thank you, Michael and John, for coming in.